Obergefreiter Karl-Heinz pressed himself against the frozen earth of his foxhole in the Hürtgen forest, late November of 1944, and experienced a moment of crystalline clarity. He would have welcomed American bombers overhead. The thought struck him as darkly absurd. For months, German propaganda broadcasts had screamed about the terror from above, the cowardly Americans who wouldn't face Wehrmacht soldiers in honest combat but instead rained fire from unreachable heights. His training officers had spent hours drilling aircraft recognition into his company, the silhouettes of B-17 flying fortresses, the twin tails of B-24 Liberators, the British Lancasters that turned German cities into infernos. But after 3 weeks of combat against the Americans, Karl-Heinz had learned a terrible truth that no propaganda film or training manual had prepared him for. The real killer wasn't circling overhead at 20,000 feet. It was positioned miles behind enemy lines, completely invisible, utterly inescapable, and firing with a precision that seemed to defy the laws of chance itself. The Americans called it the M101A1, a 105mm howitzer. German soldiers had other names for it: der Knochenmühle, the bone grinder; die ewige Trommeln, the eternal drums. Some simply called it der Tod. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The sound had become the constant background of Karl-Heinz's existence, more persistent than his own heartbeat. That distinctive whistle scream started somewhere far away, almost gentle at first, then grew in pitch and volume until every muscle in your body locked rigid in anticipation of the blast. Sometimes you heard the report first, a distant thump, muffled by distance and terrain, and you had perhaps 4 or 5 seconds to react. Sometimes you heard nothing until the shells were already screaming down. The randomness of it was its own kind of torture. What Karl-Heinz and thousands of German soldiers across the Western Front were experiencing represented one of warfare's most significant, yet least celebrated revolutions. While historians would spend decades analyzing tank tactics and air campaigns, while films would dramatize infantry assaults and fighter duels, the statistical reality told a different story entirely. According to meticulous casualty analysis conducted after the war by both U.S. Army Operational Research and German military historians examining Wehrmacht medical records, artillery fire accounted for between 70 and 75% of all German casualties inflicted on the Western Front from June of 1944 onward. Not tanks, which accounted for perhaps 10%, not small arms fire from infantry combat, perhaps another 10 to 15%, not even the feared Allied bomber offensive, which, despite its psychological impact and strategic importance, caused a relatively small percentage of actual battlefield casualties. Artillery, specifically American artillery. And no single weapon system embodied this lethality more completely than the M101A1 105mm howitzer and the doctrinal system built around it. Karl-Heinz had grown up in Stuttgart, the son of a Daimler-Benz factory foreman who'd survived 4 years in the trenches of the Great War. His father, Otto, rarely discussed that earlier conflict, but when he did, one subject always surfaced: artillery. Otto Heinz had been at Verdun in 1916, had endured bombardments at the Somme, had watched the earth itself seem to boil under sustained shelling that lasted not hours but days. He described barrages so constant, so overwhelming in their volume, that men went insane from the noise alone, huddled in bunkers, while the world above them ceased to exist as anything recognizable. But there was a rhythm to it, Otto had told his son once, during one of their rare conversations about the war. Karl-Heinz had been perhaps 15, curious about his father's reticence. The shelling would begin at dawn, sometimes earlier. It would continue for hours, even days before an attack. You knew it was coming. You had time to get deep, into the concrete bunkers, into the dugouts we'd reinforced with timber and steel rails. The shelling was terrible. Yes, I won't lie about that. Men went mad. But it was predictable. Scheduled, almost. Like factory work, in its way. You endured the bombardment, then you fought off the attack that followed. Then both sides would settle back into position and prepare for the next round. When Karl-Heinz received his conscription notice in April of 1943, barely 18 years old, his father had given him one piece of advice, based entirely on that Great War experience. Keep your head down during the bombardments. Stay deep. Don't be brave or curious. Let them waste. They're shells. Then, when it stops, that's when you fight. The bombardment will end eventually. It always does. That advice might have served Karl-Heinz well on the Eastern Front, where both German and Soviet artillery doctrines still resembled the massed bombardments of the previous war. Enormous concentrations of guns, firing tens of thousands of shells to saturate entire sectors before major offensives. But Karl-Heinz had been assigned to the reconstituted 7th Army in the West, part of the desperate German effort to defend the Siegfried Line against the Allied armies that had broken out of Normandy. And the Americans, he would discover, had revolutionized artillery warfare in ways that made his father's advice not just obsolete, but dangerously misleading. His training through the summer and fall of 1943 had focused intensively on aircraft recognition and anti-air procedures. The instructors, many of them Eastern Front veterans being rotated west or wounded men, deemed fit enough to train but not to fight, had spent hours drilling them on Allied aircraft silhouettes. They practiced dispersal drills, learned to identify the sound of different engine types, memorized the timing of typical bombing runs. The entire defensive doctrine assumed the primary threat from the Western Allies would come from above. The Americans worshipped their technology. One instructor had told Karl-Heinz's company during a lecture on Allied tactics. The instructor, an Unteroffizier named Schmidt, who was missing 3 fingers on his left hand from a factory accident, had never actually fought the Americans, but spoke with absolute confidence. They lack the stomach for honest combat, soldier to soldier. They'll try to break you from the air first. They're bombers, they're fighters. They'll send tanks next because they're afraid to close with infantry. But if you can survive the bombing and stop their armor, you'll find their infantry soft. They're factory workers and farmers playing at being soldiers. They rely on overwhelming material advantage because they lack the fighting spirit, the hardness, that 4 years of war has given the German soldier. This assessment would prove catastrophically, almost fatally wrong in nearly every particular. Karl-Heinz's unit, the 2nd Company of the 275th Infantry Division's 983rd Regiment, had been positioned in the Siegfried Line fortifications, the West Wall, in early September of 1944. The positions were formidable. Reinforced concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, extensive minefields, anti-tank obstacles called Dragon's Teeth that sprouted from the earth in geometric patterns, and prepared artillery positions. These were the fortifications that had taken years to build, the defensive line that was supposed to be impregnable. If the Americans wanted to break through to the Rhine, the thinking went, they would have to pay for every meter with blood. The American 7th Army, pushing up from southern France, reached the West Wall positions in Karl-Heinz's sector on September 6th. The first artillery barrage hit the following morning, and within 30 seconds, it had shattered every assumption Karl-Heinz had been taught about how artillery worked. The initial sound was almost gentle, a soft whisper in the distance, barely audible over the morning wind rustling through the pine trees. Then came the scream. Not human voices, though those would follow soon enough, but the distinctive rising shriek of incoming shells. Karl-Heinz, who had never experienced artillery fire before, had perhaps 3 seconds of confusion. His training had prepared him for the sound of aircraft engines. Not this, before the world around him erupted. The shells landed with surgical precision. Not a broad bombardment carpeting an entire area as his father had described from the Great War, but targeted strikes on specific positions. The bunker 300 meters to Karl-Heinz's left, the one housing Lieutenant Werner's machine gun section, took a direct hit, then the forward observation post, then the mortar pit behind the main line. 4 shells, 4 different targets, all within perhaps 45 seconds. Each impact was catastrophic. The 105mm high-explosive shells detonated with a force that Karl-Heinz could feel in his chest, even from hundreds of meters away. the concussion wave punching through the air like a physical blow. Then silence. Karl-Heinz waited, pressed against the cold concrete wall of his bunker, every nerve screaming, waiting for the sustained bombardment his father had described, the hours-long pounding that would give him time to hunker deep and endure. Instead, after perhaps 90 seconds of complete silence, he heard the distinctive rattle of American M1 Garand rifles and the slower, heavier sound of Browning machine guns. The Americans were attacking, using the brief artillery strike to suppress specific, defensive positions, while their infantry advanced under the cover the guns had created. The attack was repulsed. The American infantry withdrew after encountering the minefield and taking fire from positions the artillery had missed, but what the artillery had achieved in less than 2 minutes was remarkable. With fewer than a dozen shells, it had neutralized 3 critical defensive positions and killed or wounded 17 German soldiers, including Lieutenant Werner, whose bunker had taken the direct hit. The accuracy was terrifying. The economy of it was somehow worse. "That wasn't a bombardment," Feldwebel Dietrich said afterward, his hands shaking visibly as he tried to light a cigarette. Dietrich was 34, a veteran of Poland, France, and 2 years in Russia before a wound had gotten him reassigned to the West. He'd survived Kursk. He'd endured Soviet artillery barrages that had turned entire grid squares into moonscapes. That was something else. That was surgery. Over the following days, as American probing attacks continued, the pattern repeated with variations. The Americans would probe the defenses, identify specific positions through reconnaissance or simply by observing which bunkers returned fire, and then call in artillery strikes with unnerving precision. Sometimes the barrage would last 30 seconds, sometimes 5 minutes, but it was never random, never wasteful, and most unsettling of all, never predictable in its timing or duration. You couldn't prepare for it because you never knew when it would come or how long it would last. You couldn't endure it by going deep because it might be over before you reached the deepest shelter, and emerging too late meant missing the infantry attack that inevitably followed. The old rules, the lessons from the Great War that had been passed down through doctrine and personal experience, simply didn't apply. What Karl-Heinz was witnessing was the mature form of a system the U.S. Army had been developing since the interwar period, refined through combat experience in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. The Americans had invested enormous resources into 3 key innovations that, when combined, transformed artillery from an area weapon into a precision instrument of unprecedented lethality. The first innovation was communications. Every American artillery battery was equipped with radio systems that allowed forward observers, specially trained soldiers, positioned with the frontline infantry to call in fire missions and adjust fire in real time. The SCR 610 radio set, standard equipment for forward observer teams by 1944, could transmit clear voice communications up to 8 miles, even in difficult terrain. This meant that within minutes of identifying a target, American forces could bring accurate artillery fire down on it. German artillery, by contrast, still relied heavily on telephone lines that were vulnerable to being cut by shelling, or on runners physically carrying fire missions back to battery positions, a process that could take 15 or 20 minutes, an eternity in fluid combat situations. The second innovation was standardization and training. The U.S. Army had developed elaborate fire direction procedures that allowed multiple batteries, even multiple battalions, to mass their fire on a single target with devastating speed and accuracy. Every artillery unit trained using the same methods, the same tables, the same communication protocols. This meant that a battalion fire direction center could coordinate the fire of 12 or even 18 guns on a single target, walking the shells in a precise pattern that left no room for escape. The time-on-target technique, perfected by American artillery in 1944, could have shells from multiple batteries firing at different ranges all impact simultaneously, giving defenders no warning and no time to take cover between impacts. The third innovation, and perhaps the most important, was industrial capacity. The M101A1 howitzer itself was a masterpiece of military engineering relatively lightweight at just over 2¼ tons. It could be towed by a 2.5-ton truck or even a jeep, giving it mobility that German artillery pieces, many still horse-drawn in 1944, simply couldn't match. Its maximum range of 11,200 meters allowed it to strike deep behind German lines while remaining safely distant from counterfire. And its rate of fire, a well-trained crew could sustain 4 rounds per minute, almost indefinitely, meant that when American artillery spoke, it spoke with overwhelming volume. But the gun's capabilities meant nothing without ammunition, and here American industrial might made itself felt in ways that still stagger the imagination. By 1944, American factories were producing 105mm ammunition at a rate that would have seemed impossible to military planners just a few years earlier. A single American artillery battalion, 3 batteries of 4 guns each, could expect to fire more shells in a single day of heavy combat than an entire German division's artillery complement might fire in a week. And they never seemed to run short. Ever. Karl-Heinz experienced the full lethality of this system on September 14th, during what his company had been told would be a limited counterattack to retake a village the Americans had occupied the previous day. The plan was straightforward: advance under cover of morning fog, overwhelm the American infantry before they could properly establish defensive positions, and retake the village. Feldwebel Dietrich had briefed them the night before with what seemed like reasonable confidence. They'd been assured that German artillery, what remained of it, would support the attack with a preparatory bombardment. The German guns fired for approximately 10 minutes, beginning at dawn. Karl-Heinz counted perhaps 40 shells landing in and around the village, raising pillars of smoke and dust. Then the guns fell silent. They'd expended their carefully hoarded ammunition allocation for the attack. The company rose from their assembly positions and began advancing across the open ground toward the village. Roughly 120 men spread across a front of about 300 meters. They made it perhaps 200 meters before the American artillery responded. Karl-Heinz would later struggle to describe what happened next in any coherent way. The first shells landed among the lead platoon. He saw men simply disappear in the eruptions of earth and fire. Then more shells, walking back toward his position with mechanical precision. Then shells landing ahead of them, cutting off any advance. Then shells behind them, sealing off retreat. Within what couldn't have been more than 90 seconds, American artillery had boxed the entire company in a killing zone, roughly 100 meters square. The fire was coming from multiple directions. Karl-Heinz could hear the different pitches of the incoming shells, indicating different distances and trajectories. Later he would learn this was the American time-on-target technique, where forward observers had called in fire from at least 3 different batteries, possibly more, all coordinating to trap the German company in a precisely defined area. The shelling continued for perhaps 3 minutes, though Karl-Heinz's perception of time had collapsed into an eternal present of noise and terror. When it finally stopped, Karl-Heinz found himself in a shell crater, his uniform torn, his hearing reduced to a high-pitched whine, blood running from his nose though he couldn't remember being hit. Of the 120 men who'd begun the attack, 73 were dead or wounded. The survivors, Karl-Heinz among them, crawled back to German lines in small groups, dragging wounded comrades when possible, abandoning the dead because recovering bodies under American observation meant calling down more artillery. The counterattack had lasted approximately 7 minutes from the moment they'd left their positions to the moment the last survivors stumbled back into friendly lines. German artillery had fired perhaps 40 shells over 10 minutes. American artillery had fired. Karl-Heinz later heard estimates from the company commander who survived somewhere between 200 and 300 shells in under 4 minutes. The disparity wasn't just numerical, it was philosophical. The Germans were rationing shells like food in a siege. The Americans were using them like water from an open tap. That night, in what remained of the company position, Feldwebel Dietrich gathered the survivors, now perhaps 40 men who could still fight. He said something that would stay with Karl-Heinz for the rest of his life. Everything they told us was a lie. They said the Americans were soft. They said they relied on technology because they couldn't fight. But this isn't weakness. This is something we can't match. They don't need to be better soldiers. They just need to drop shells on us until we stop existing. Through October and into November of 1944, as American forces ground slowly eastward through the West Wall fortifications, Karl-Heinz began to understand the true dimensions of what he and his fellow soldiers faced. The psychological impact of American artillery went far beyond its physical destructiveness. The Great War bombardments, terrible as they were, had at least been comprehensible, massed fire, predictable patterns, defined beginning and ending points. You could adapt to them, mentally if not physically. You could prepare. American artillery was different. It was responsive, appearing within minutes of being called, sometimes faster. It was accurate, landing on specific positions rather than general areas. It was discriminating, sometimes firing a single round to range a target, then unleashing devastating barrages once the spotters had the exact coordinates. And most unsettling of all, it seemed infinite. The Americans never seemed to conserve ammunition. If they identified a target worth shooting at, they shot at it, regardless of whether it was a company of infantry or a single machine gun position or even a suspected observation post that might be nothing more than a German soldier who'd been careless about showing himself. The constant availability of fire support gave American infantry a confidence that German soldiers found almost arrogant. In several small engagements Karl-Heinz witnessed, American infantry units that encountered strong resistance would simply pull back a few hundred meters and call in artillery. They didn't attempt to maneuver around the position or assault it with superior numbers. They just had someone with a radio call in coordinates, and within minutes shells would start landing, with methodical precision, until the German position was obliterated or its defenders driven out. Then the American infantry would advance again, and the process would repeat. By contrast, German requests for artillery support on the increasingly rare occasions when artillery was available at all might take 30 minutes or longer to process, by which time the tactical situation had usually changed completely. And even when German artillery did respond, they might fire a dozen rounds before going silent, ammunition exhausted. The psychological effect of this disparity was corrosive. German soldiers began to feel that they were fighting an enemy who operated under completely different constraints, who existed in a different material reality altogether. A soldier in Karl-Heinz's platoon, a former schoolteacher from Bavaria named Georg, tried to explain it one night in late October. They were huddled in a bunker during a cold rain, listening to distant artillery fire always present. Now, like weather. It's not that they're better soldiers, Georg said, speaking quietly, as if afraid the Americans might somehow hear. It's that they're fighting a different war. We're fighting like it's 1918, counting shells, rationing ammunition, making every shot count because we might not get more. They're fighting like they have infinite resources, and the terrible thing is, they actually do. They can waste more ammunition in a day than we fire in a week, and it doesn't matter to them. It's not even waste to them. It's just what they do. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Army Ordnance, American forces on the Western Front, fired approximately 27 million rounds of 105mm ammunition between D-Day and VE Day, roughly 11 months of combat. That averaged out to approximately 2.5 million rounds per month, or about 80,000 rounds per day, though usage obviously varied greatly based on operational tempo. To put that in perspective, the entire German artillery arm on the Western Front in late 1944 was estimated to be firing fewer than 30,000 rounds per day across all calibers combined, and that rate was declining monthly as both ammunition production and the artillery pieces themselves were ground down by attrition. The M101A1 howitzers themselves proved remarkably durable under sustained use. The gun tubes were rated for approximately 10,000 rounds before requiring replacement, and American logistics ensured that replacement tubes were readily available. German artillery pieces, by contrast, often remained in service long past their designed lifespan simply because replacements weren't available, leading to decreased accuracy and increased risk of catastrophic failure. But beyond the numbers, beyond the industrial capacity, and the communications networks and the training protocols. What made American artillery truly devastating was how it was integrated into overall tactical doctrine. American infantry commanders at the company level and above had access to forward observers who could bring fire down within minutes. This meant that American infantry units operated with the knowledge that they had, effectively, a battalion of artillery in their back pocket for every engagement. They could be aggressive because they knew that if they encountered something they couldn't handle with rifles and machine guns, they could call in the big guns. German infantry, by contrast, had largely learned to operate as if artillery support simply didn't exist. In many cases, ammunition shortages meant that artillery was reserved for major operations or defensive emergencies. This forced German infantry to be more cautious, to avoid situations where they might need fire support, which in turn ceded initiative to the Americans. Karl-Heinz saw this dynamic play out repeatedly through November as American forces pushed into the Hurtgen forest, where his unit had been repositioned after the west wall positions became untenable. The forest was dense, the terrain broken by ravines and streams, visibility often measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters. It should have favored the defenders' close terrain where American artillery would have difficulty spotting targets and where infantry would have to close to point-blank range. But the Americans had adapted. Their forward observers moved with the lead infantry platoons, often just a few meters behind the point men. When they encountered German positions in bunkers or fighting positions, they would mark them with colored smoke grenades, pull back to covered positions, and call in artillery. The shells would come crashing through the forest canopy, Karl-Heinz learned to recognize the distinctive sound of shells clipping branches and tree trunks on their way down and detonate with devastating effect. The forest itself became a weapon against the defenders. Tree bursts from shells detonating in the canopy showered shrapnel downward, and the concussion of explosions in the confined spaces between trees was amplified rather than dissipated. In one engagement in mid-November, Karl-Heinz's squad was positioned in a bunker overlooking a forest trail when an American patrol appeared. They held their fire. The patrol was small, perhaps 8 men, not worth revealing their position. But one of the Americans must have spotted something, because within 2 minutes, colored smoke began drifting up from a position about 50 meters away. The squad leader, a veteran corporal named Matthias, understood immediately what was happening. "Out! Everyone out now!" he screamed, and the squad scrambled out of the bunker and into the forest, running as fast as the terrain allowed. They'd made it perhaps 100 meters when the artillery came in. Karl-Heinz looked back and saw the bunker they'd occupied 30 seconds earlier simply cease to exist, replaced by a crater and a tangle of shattered logs and earth. The Americans had fired perhaps 6 rounds. Karl-Heinz counted the impacts, and the entire area where the bunker had been was transformed into raw, smoking earth. The precision was terrifying, but what haunted Karl-Heinz was the casualness of it. The Americans had spotted a possible position, marked it, called in fire, and obliterated it, all in perhaps 5 minutes. They'd expended 6 105mm shells, perhaps $300 worth of ammunition at American production costs, to destroy a bunker that might have contained anywhere from 0 to a dozen German soldiers. They didn't know for certain the bunker was occupied. They didn't need to know. They had shells to spare, and shooting was cheaper and safer than investigating. This approach to warfare, treating ammunition as an essentially infinite resource to be expended whenever tactically useful, rather than carefully hoarded, represented a fundamental difference in how the two armies operated. The U.S. Army in World War II was fighting, in many ways, the first truly industrialized war, where the factory and the battlefield were seamlessly integrated. Shells fired in the Hurtgen forest in November of 1944 had been manufactured in plants in Ohio or Pennsylvania just weeks earlier, shipped across the Atlantic in convoys that, despite U-boat attacks, maintained a steady flow of material, then distributed through a logistics network that could deliver ammunition to artillery batteries in quantities that would have seemed fantastical to military planners of earlier eras. By late November, as winter closed in on the Hurtgen forest, Karl-Heinz had become something of a connoisseur of American artillery fire, able to identify different types of missions by their sound and pattern. There was the single ranging shot, fired to check coordinates before a full fire mission. There was the walking barrage, where shells marched across terrain in a line, used to force movement or cut off retreat. There was the box barrage, like the one that had destroyed his company on September 14th, trapping targets in a killing zone. And there was concentration fire, where multiple batteries would converge on a single point, used to destroy hardened positions or break up assembly areas. He'd also learned to distinguish between different shell types by their effects. High explosive shells detonated with a sharp crack and threw shrapnel in all directions. These were used against personnel and light fortifications. White phosphorus shells burst with a distinctive whoosh and created clouds of white smoke that burned at extreme temperatures. These were used for marking targets, creating smoke screens, or in the grimmer role of burning defenders out of positions. Occasionally, they'd face proximity-fused shells, a new American innovation that detonated automatically at a preset height above the ground, showering shrapnel downward before defenders could take cover. These were particularly feared because they negated the protection of foxholes and trenches. The worst part, Karl-Heinz came to realize, wasn't the fear during the shelling itself. Terror had a way of focusing the mind, reducing existence to the immediate present, the next breath, the next second of survival. The worst part was the waiting afterward, the knowledge that it could happen again at any moment without warning or pattern. German soldiers developed a kind of fatalistic hypervigilance, constantly listening for that distant whisper that preceded incoming shells, unable to relax even in supposedly safe rear areas because American artillery could reach kilometers behind the front lines. Sleep became difficult, then nearly impossible. Men would jolt awake at sounds that resembled the whistle of incoming shells, wind through broken trees, the cry of certain birds, even the sound of their own artillery firing, which was rare enough by December that it had become unfamiliar and alarming. Medical officers reported increasing cases of what they termed Granatenschock shell shock, though by late 1944 there was little they could do about it. Men deemed unable to fight were simply kept in rear areas when possible, or sent back to the line when manpower shortages made that luxury impossible. Karl-Heinz watched men he'd trained with, men who'd been steady under fire in September, gradually deteriorate under the constant artillery pressure. Georg, the former schoolteacher, developed a tremor in his hands that never stopped. Another soldier, a farm boy from East Prussia named Peter, began flinching violently at any sudden noise, even a door slamming or a cup being set down hard on a table. Feldwebel Dietrich, the veteran of Russia who'd seemed unshakable, started drinking more heavily, using the increasingly scarce alcohol rations to achieve brief oblivion. By early December, Karl-Heinz's unit, what remained of it after 3 months of combat, had been reduced to perhaps 40% of its original strength. Some losses had been to small arms fire, a few to mines and booby traps, one man to disease. But the overwhelming majority had been to artillery. The company kept a casualty log, a grim accounting that Dietrich maintained with meticulous care. Of 78 men killed or seriously wounded between September and early December, 61 had been victims of artillery fire. The ratio matched what Karl-Heinz was hearing from other units. Roughly 70 to 80% of casualties came from shells, not bullets. The psychological impact of this went beyond simple fear. It created a sense of helplessness that corroded morale more effectively than any propaganda. In infantry, combat, soldiers could at least theorize that their individual skill, alertness, or courage might make a difference. You could shoot back at infantry. You could take cover from machine guns. You could even, theoretically, fight tanks with anti-tank weapons if you were brave or desperate enough. But artillery was different. Artillery killed you from miles away, fired by men you would never see, aimed by observers you couldn't locate, falling from the sky with no warning and no chance for response. Your survival depended entirely on factors beyond your control, whether the forward observer happened to spot your position, whether the fire direction officer chose your coordinates, whether the shells happened to land on your specific foxhole rather than the one 3 meters away. This randomness was perhaps the worst aspect. Karl-Heinz had seen shells land directly in occupied foxholes, killing everyone instantly. He'd also seen shells land within meters of positions and cause no casualties at all, the shrapnel somehow missing everyone through pure chance. There was no pattern to learn, no skill to develop, no experience that made you safer. You simply endured and hoped, and tried not to think too much about odds that were steadily turning against you. On December 8, 1944, Karl-Heinz experienced what he would later recognize as the symbolic culmination of everything the American artillery system represented. His platoon had been ordered to hold a position along a forest road, a seemingly minor assignment in the larger tapestry of the Hürtgen Forest battle. They dug in as well as the frozen ground permitted, established fields of fire, positioned the single machine gun they still possessed, and settled in to wait. Around mid-morning, they observed an American supply convoy moving along a road about 800 meters distant, clearly visible through gaps in the forest. The convoy consisted of perhaps a dozen trucks, moving slowly over the muddy, rutted road. Accompanying the convoy were several vehicles that Karl-Heinz recognized as self-propelled artillery. M7 Priest vehicles, 105mm howitzers mounted on tank chassis for mobile fire support. The platoon leader, a young lieutenant who'd replaced the previous officer killed by artillery 3 weeks earlier, faced a tactical decision. They could potentially ambush the convoy. They had a good position, decent fields of fire, and the element of surprise. But any attack would immediately reveal their position and invite retaliation. The lieutenant decided to observe and report, but not engage. What happened next encapsulated everything about American material superiority. The convoy stopped. Soldiers dismounted and began, with apparent casualness, unloading ammunition. Not just a few boxes, but crate after crate after crate of shells. They were resupplying the self-propelled guns, Karl-Heinz realized, and they were doing it in broad daylight, within theoretical range of German positions, with no apparent concern for security beyond a few sentries. The unloading continued for nearly an hour. Karl-Heinz tried to count the crates being transferred from trucks to the ammunition racks on the priests, but lost track after 60 or 70. Each crate contained multiple shells. The Americans were moving what appeared to be hundreds of rounds of 105mm ammunition in a routine resupply operation, casually, almost carelessly, in what was theoretically a combat zone. When the convoy finally moved on, the lieutenant turned to the platoon with an expression that was equal parts amazement and despair. "That ammunition," he said quietly, "was more than our entire division's artillery has fired in the past 2 weeks, and they're just trucking it around, stacking it up like firewood." That image, American soldiers casually handling more artillery ammunition than an entire German division possessed, stayed with Karl-Heinz. It represented something more fundamental than tactical superiority or technological advantage. It represented a chasm in industrial capacity so vast that no amount of fighting spirit or tactical brilliance could bridge it. Germany was fighting a war of scarcity, carefully rationing every shell, every bullet, every liter of fuel. America was fighting a war of abundance, where ammunition could be expended freely because there was always more coming. The strategic implications of American artillery dominance extended far beyond the immediate tactical situations Karl-Heinz experienced. At the operational level, the sheer weight of American artillery fire shaped how battles developed and how German forces had to respond. German commanders found themselves unable to mass forces for counterattacks because any concentration of troops would immediately attract devastating artillery fire. American forward observers and aerial reconnaissance made it nearly impossible to hide troop movements, and once spotted, concentrations would be shelled into dispersal or oblivion within minutes. This forced German tactics to become increasingly dispersed and defensive, which in turn played exactly into American strengths. Spread-out defensive positions meant less concentrated firepower, making it easier for American infantry to advance with artillery support. And when German forces did attempt to concentrate for counterattacks, as they would during the Ardennes offensive, beginning just days after Karl-Heinz's observation of the supply convoy, they discovered that American artillery could break up attacks even when American infantry was outnumbered or surprised. The Battle of the Bulge, which began on December 16th, 1944, would provide the ultimate test case for German forces attempting to fight without artillery superiority. Initial German success came in conditions of heavy fog that grounded American aircraft and limited visibility for forward observers, temporarily negating some of American artillery's advantages. But as weather cleared and American artillery could fully engage, the German offensive ground to a halt. At battles like Elsenborn Ridge and Bastogne, American artillery fire proved decisive in breaking German attacks. At Bastogne alone, American artillery batteries fired over 47,000 rounds during the siege, with some individual batteries firing more than 1,000 rounds per day rates that would have depleted a German division's entire ammunition stockpile in 72 hours. Karl-Heinz, still in the Hürtgen forest sector during the Bulge offensive, experienced this from the defensive side. His unit was pinned in place, unable to be withdrawn to support the offensive because doing so would create gaps the Americans could exploit. They remained in their positions, enduring continued American artillery harassment, while listening to increasingly desperate radio reports from the Ardennes about ammunition, shortages and fuel exhaustion. The contrast was stark. American units at Bastogne, completely surrounded, still had artillery ammunition being resupplied by air. German units making the main effort of the offensive were running out of shells within days of the attack beginning. By January of 1945, as the German offensive collapsed and American forces resumed their eastward advance, Karl-Heinz had reached a kind of numb acceptance. The war was lost. Perhaps it had been lost since 1943, or even earlier, but the artillery made it visceral and undeniable. Germany couldn't compete with an enemy that could expend ammunition as freely as the Americans did. Every shell that fell was a small demonstration of industrial capacity that Germany simply couldn't match. The final irony, the one that would stay with Karl-Heinz long after the war ended, was that German propaganda had been partially right about American reliance on technology and material superiority. Where the propaganda had gone catastrophically wrong was in treating this as a weakness rather than recognizing it as an overwhelming strength. The Americans weren't soft because they relied on artillery. They were smart. Why risk soldiers in close combat when you could achieve the same objective by dropping high-explosive shells on the problem? Why conserve ammunition when your factories could produce more faster than you could expend it? The M101A1 howitzer would remain in American service long after the war ended, seeing action in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, a testament to the soundness of its design. But more importantly, the doctrinal system built around it: responsive fire support, massed fires, integration of forward observers with infantry units, and the industrial capacity to provide effectively unlimited ammunition would become the template for modern artillery employment. The U.S. Army had discovered that in modern warfare, the side that could bring more firepower to bear faster and more accurately would usually win, regardless of other factors. Karl-Heinz survived the war, surrendering to American forces in April of 1945 as German resistance in the West finally collapsed. In the POW cage, he found himself in conversation with an American artillery officer, a captain from Ohio who spoke passable German. Karl-Heinz asked him a question that had haunted him through the final months of the war. Had the Americans ever worried about running out of shells? The captain looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Run out? No, never. We had allocation limits sometimes, times when higher headquarters would tell us to conserve ammunition for an upcoming operation. But running out? That wasn't something we thought about. If we needed more, we just called for it and it showed up, usually within a day or two. Karl-Heinz tried to explain that German artillery units were often limited to a dozen shells per day, sometimes fewer. The captain's expression shifted from puzzlement to something like pity. A dozen shells per day, for an entire battery. He shook his head slowly. We would fire that in the first 5 minutes of a fire mission. Sometimes a single gun would fire that many just ranging a target before the real fire for effect began. That conversation, perhaps more than any single combat experience, crystallized for Karl-Heinz the reality of what he and his fellow German soldiers had faced. They hadn't been defeated by better soldiers or superior tactics. Though American infantry had proven far from the soft, reluctant fighters that propaganda had promised, they'd been defeated by an economic system that could produce artillery shells faster than those shells could be fired, by a logistics network that could deliver those shells to the front lines with casual efficiency, and by a military doctrine that treated ammunition as a renewable resource to be expended freely rather than a precious commodity to be hoarded. The 105mm howitzer, the M101A, one that American soldiers had called the 105, with almost affectionate familiarity, had killed more German soldiers than any other single weapon system in the Western theatre. Not dramatically, not in the spectacular fashion of bombers or tanks that would dominate popular memory of the war, but methodically, consistently, with a grinding efficiency that wore down German resistance one shell at a time. The statistics bore this out. Contemporary U.S. Army analysis estimated that artillery caused between 70 and 75% of all German casualties, with the 105mm howitzer being the most numerous and widely used artillery piece in American service. For Karl-Heinz and thousands of German veterans of the Western Front, the sound of that incoming whistle scream would never truly fade. It would echo in unexpected moments decades later, a certain wind through trees, a distant thunderstorm, even fireworks on New Year's Eve. And with it would come the memory of a truth that propaganda and ideology had tried to obscure. In modern industrial warfare, the nation that could turn its factories into an extension of the battlefield, that could deliver overwhelming material superiority to the point of contact, would ultimately prevail regardless of the fighting spirit or tactical skill of its opponents. The real terror of American artillery wasn't the individual shell or even the devastating barrages. It was what those shells represented, the vast, impersonal, unstoppable machinery of American industrial power, methodically grinding down German resistance one fire mission at a time, backed by a productive capacity so enormous that ammunition could be treated as essentially infinite. German soldiers had been taught to fear the bombers overhead, but they learned to fear the guns they couldn't see, firing from positions miles away, never running dry, never ceasing, always ready to respond within minutes to any target worth engaging. That was why Karl-Heinz, huddled in his foxhole in November of 1944, had found himself praying for bombers instead. Bombers you could hear coming. Bombers flew missions and then left. Bombers had to return to base, reload, rest. The 105mm howitzers were always there, always ready, always loaded, waiting for coordinates. They represented a new kind of warfare, one where the front line was wherever the shells happened to be falling at any given moment, and safety existed nowhere within 11,000 meters of an American forward observer with a radio. In the end, it wasn't the weapon itself that mattered most, but what it represented. The transformation of warfare into an industrial process, where victory went not necessarily to the bravest or most skilled, but to the side that could deliver more steel and high explosive to the decisive point, faster and more accurately than the enemy could respond. The Americans had mastered this new form of warfare, and the M101A1 howitzer was its most perfect expression, reliable, accurate, mobile, and backed by an industrial system that ensured it would never want for ammunition. That was the truth Karl-Heinz had discovered in the forests and fields of Western Germany in the autumn and winter of 1944, and it was a truth that no amount of propaganda about fighting spirit or tactical superiority could overcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.